Hello, I'm John Tico, and if you're looking for the Garrulous Gavel podcast, you found it. In this episode, I talk with Jessica Tillipman, an assistant dean at the George Washington University Law School, where she specializes in anti-corruption law. I'll be talking with Dean Tillipman about corruption in the U.S. government and the tools that we have in this country to fight against corruption by government officials. We'll be getting garrulous about a number of high-profile cases and issues, like the Governor Bob McDonnell case, the Fat Leonard Scandal, the Trump International Hotel, and the Hunter Biden paintings. And then at the end, we'll chat about Dean Tillipman's experiences being both the dean at a major law school and the parent of two small children, all while working from home in the midst of a global pandemic. You've heard about this global pandemic, haven't you? Good. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello and welcome to the Garrulous Gavel. I am John Tico, and my guest today is Jessica Tillipman, who has the very long title that I'm about to read to you. It is Assistant Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies and Government Contracts Advisory Council Professorial Lecturer in Government Contracts Law, Practice, and Policy. And we are going to be talking today to Dean Tillipman about corruption in government. What is government corruption? What tools do we have in the law in our country to fight corruption? How could we make those tools better? And we'll be touching on some of the more high-profile, kind of in-the-news examples of government corruption from recent years. We'll be mentioning perhaps Governor Bob McDonnell's case out of Virginia, the Fat Leonard Scandal involving the U.S. Navy. We'll be talking about Trump International Hotel and the Hunter Biden paintings. Who doesn't love those topics? And then towards the end, we're going to talk to Dean Tillipman about all the fun she has had being a dean at a major U.S. law school while also being the parent of two small children in the middle of a pandemic lockdown, and some of the funny things that have happened to her as a result of that. So it's going to be an interesting conversation, and we'll start, as we always do, by just trying to meet and get to know our guest a little bit. So Dean Tillipman, why don't you just start by telling us where you're from?
First, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. If you need to take a break after reading my long title, let me know. It's almost makes me laugh every time. But no, I've lived in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years, but I'm originally from Iowa and then Cincinnati, Ohio, where I basically grew up and went to college. The college I went to is Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, a small town of Oxford, Ohio. Beautiful campus, red brick campus, delightful restaurants, wonderful place to go to school. And many people think that means I went to school in Florida. It does not. Miami was a university before Florida was a state, or so says the T-shirts that they sell in their athletic stores. So I went there, and then after college, I came to DC for law school.
Great. And where'd you go to law school?
I went to the same place I'm working now. So I went to law school at GW Law, or the George Washington University Law School in DC. So as you can see, I haven't made it very far away from the school, though I did take a break and do some other things, but I've been back, and it's a wonderful place to be.
Yeah, it's a great law school. And for those of you who don't know, it's in the sort of Foggy Bottom neighborhood of Washington, D.C., right next to where the State Department is. So it's right in the middle of all of the fun DC government and politics action. So you went to law school there. When did you graduate?
So I graduated in 2003, and it was, right after law school, I got a job clerking for Judge Lawrence Margolis of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, which actually is just down the street from GW Law School. So next, besides the State Department, we're actually by the World Bank, the IMF, the White House, and the Court of Federal Claims is actually right by the White House. So I didn't go too far. after I graduated from law school, just down the street to clerk for a year. And then after that, went to go work for a law firm.
Yeah, so tell our listeners a little bit about the Court of Federal Claims, because that is a federal court, but it has a little bit of a unique role in the judicial system, and is something most people I don't think really know about. So what is the Court of Federal Claims?
So it really has unique jurisdiction. Some things are obvious. People understand district courts and Court of Appeals, and they understand a tax court or a bankruptcy court or armed services, but it's kind of this, I don't want to say it's a niche because it covers so much ground, but basically it involves claims involving the United States government. So the reason that I went, and the reason that so many GW law students often go, is because it is involves a lot of cases of government contracts. And as you could tell from my lengthy title, I'm the head of the government contracts program, and we have a huge government contracts program at the law school. It's been around since 1960. And so we've just had decades worth of students that have gone and clerked at the Court of Federal Claims because of our government contracts expertise. It also has cases like takings and tax cases, among others. It also has vaccine injury component to it as well. Some special masters over there. So it's kind of got this really unique area. And then it's appellate courts, the federal circuit. So that's where you're going to hear patent cases and then all the cases on appeal from the Court of Federal Claims.
Sure. Yeah. And did you enjoy the experience of being a law clerk?
Yeah, I worked for the most wonderful man. He is also an alum of the law school. He's unfortunately and very sadly no longer with us, which was really heartbreaking because he had such loyal family of clerks. But I felt very fortunate to get the clerkship. So I knew I was going to be going to a law firm after graduation from law school. And I was on spring break, and a professor that I had worked for as a research assistant called me on my phone. God knows what kind of cell phone I had at that time, back in the day, and said, you need to rush back to Washington, D.C. Judge Garrulous still hasn't hired his second law clerk, and he will interview you this week. So I rushed home for my spring break and met just the nicest man. That was Judge Garrulous. And I learned a lot from him. And two big things. One is he always had this upbeat personality. If you'd ask him how his day was, he'd always respond with incredible. And it was so loud, and it really just set a tone for the office, which is something I've tried to do in my own career. And the other thing that I loved about him is that he loved simple language, simple, clear language. He wanted anybody to be able to read an opinion. You didn't have to have a law degree. So I loved the clarity and the simplicity of his opinions. And that really I've taken to heart in my own writing as well. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I know you can really learn a lot from a year. Did you clerk for a year? Was it just 1 year?
I clerked for a year. Primarily don't use Latin if you don't have to.
Yeah, and a year of clerking. I mean, whenever I talk to folks that are in law school, I always encourage them to take that opportunity if they have the opportunity. It's really a great learning experience. And then you said after your clerkship, you went to work for a law firm, and that was Jenner and Block, right?
It was.
So, I mean, I've been a lawyer for a while, so I sort of know the lay of the land, different law firms and what types of firms they are and firm culture and all that. But, why don't you give our listeners who don't know that a little sense of what type of law firm Jenner and Block is or was at the time that you worked there?
So at the time when I worked there, it was the DC office of a Chicago firm. Jenner Block is its home is in Chicago, but the really unique practice in DC. A lot of their attorneys do Supreme Court appellate work with really impressive cases, really huge pro bono practice. But I was brought in and recruited for doing government contracts work because I already had some prior exposure in my work that I had done in law school. But also I had this weird hybrid where I split my time 50% in government contracts and 50% of my time was in the white collar practice. And that a lot of it had to do with me, the way I even went to law school. When I was going to law school, I was determined to be a prosecutor. So I spent all my time in law school doing all these criminal externships and taking all these criminal law related classes. And it wasn't until I met Steve Schooner, my now colleague, who introduced me to government contracts, that I started to get more involved in government contracts work. And so really, when I looked to my time at Jenner, it was really a marriage of what I was doing, all along, both criminal and government contracts, which is rather unusual in the world of law practice. Usually you have your white collar people that are dealing mostly with, just with criminal work. And then you have your government contracts folks, it's a FAR-based practice, and, it's administrative in nature. And most of their investigations you're dealing with, they're going to be investigations, but it's usually civil. And so it was a really interesting to have like a foot in both worlds, which is really carried with me today.
Yeah, and you used a word in there that we probably need to define for our listeners. You said a FAR-based practice, and they're probably thinking, like, what does that mean? It's like it's far away. What? So what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so the FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which govern the practice of government contracts. Interestingly, it's this myriad rules and regulations that govern the practice of government contracts in the U.S. federal system. And it is, my goodness, it is a huge thing. And it's part of the reason that our students are so successful in getting employment after graduation, is because I actually have mugs that we give to our graduates that say on it, I speak FAR fluently, because it's really almost seems like a foreign language sometimes to people, but it's a lot of rules and regulations, and it can be kind of murky. But that's the world I live in.
Yeah. And so how long did you stay at Jenner & Block?
So I was at Jenner from, I want to say, 2004 to 2008, the end of 2008, when I was recruited to come in full-time to GW Law School. But I'd already been an adjunct at that point, too.
I guess there's sort of maybe two parts to your job at GW. You teach some classes, right? But then you are also an assistant dean, which, I guess I should just ask you, what does it mean to be an assistant dean at the law school?
Yeah, so the two hats. So I'll tell you first about the teaching part. So I started teaching fairly soon after I arrived at Jenner, doing things like supervising, student notes for the Public Contract Law Journal, which is the government contracts law journal at the law school, also, co-owned by the ABA. And so I started supervising that and teaching, and I always knew I really enjoyed it. So when the opportunity arose, and I was asked to come in full time, I kind of jumped at the chance. And so I've had a long kind of path through teaching and various classes and various administrative roles. But my current role is now the Assistant Dean for Government Procurement Law, which is effectively it's the head of the Government Procurement Law program, like the program director, if you will. I'm responsible for supervising 3 different degree programs, our JD concentration in government procurement, our LLMs, these are existing lawyers that come back to specialize in government procurement, and then our MSL program, which is our newest degree program. These are government procurement or acquisition professionals that don't have a law degree but can benefit from our coursework. So it's supervising those degree programs. It's planning a lot of different programming and opportunities. It's overseeing a lot of student work and writing. It's really just kind of, I call it like the heart of a lot of what we do in this area. And it's varied. Every day is different, but it's a lot of fun, and you get to meet a lot of really great people in this role.
Yeah. And I mean, just a pitch for GW Law School. I mean, again, for anybody who's interested in this particular area of law, for government procurement, government contracts, whatever you want to call it, it's probably one of the best places to get some training.
The best place to get some training.
Well, I have to be a little neutral, but yeah, I'll trust you on that. I mean, why don't we just kind of like transition from there into our topic today, talking about government corruption, because I think there is I don't think it's coincidental that somebody who focuses on government procurement regulation would also be a little bit of an expert in corruption and anti-corruption, because as I understand it, at least a big chunk of the sort of regulatory environment around government procurement is driven by this concern, right? In other words, a concern about making sure that when the government goes out into the market and purchases goods and services, that does not lead to sort of government corruption. So maybe a good place to kind of start that discussion would be to just define some terms, which lawyers like to do. So how would you define the word corruption, at least as it relates to a government?
There's no singular definition of what is corrupt, if you will. A lot of times you'll look to what some of the major international organizations or major civil society organizations will say, and many times it involves kind of the abuse of power for private gain, and that's kind of the standard definition you typically see with it. But I think that encompasses a lot, but I also think that sometimes we look at corruption narrowly when we think of corruption, at least in that context of looking at it from almost the bribery, like the corrupt official context. Whereas I think corruption, and I think a lot of that's reflected in the class I teach at GW, is much broader, encompassing things like that you do. Fraud. I think fraud is corruption, and I think collusion is corruption. And so I think it's broader, but if you were really talking about kind of the core when we're dealing with, officials, I think we're talking about the abuse of trust or the misuse of trust for private gain.
And I mean, I guess sort of the archetype of that would be literally the government official who says, you're only going to get this contract from my agency, or you're only going to get this license from my agency, or whatever it is that the business person needs if you pay me a kickback or a bribe, right? That's sort of almost the most obvious form of corruption. But I imagine that in practice, it's often more subtle than that. So what would you, maybe not always, maybe sometimes it's just that, maybe it's just straight up bribery, but like, what are the other types of corruption that we would need to be concerned about? Again, kind of focusing on at least the United States for the moment.
So I will say, in response to what you said, former Congressman Duke Cunningham actually had a price list in his office of the amount each contract award would cost, a bribery price list, which I actually put into my PowerPoints when I teach it to students. So never underestimate people willing to create or put up physical evidence like that. But it can vary. Certainly it can come in that form of bribery. A lot of the stuff I deal with deals with the ability to win a contract, or to get appointed to something, or to, if you think about getting, exchanging something to get a reduction in fines or penalties. So it can be any time you can use your government power in some sort of way to privately enrich yourself. And so it's really quite broad. But, most cases, the first case I ever worked on was not based in the United States, and it really did have a brown paper bag full of cash. But most cases are a lot, lot less obvious than that. These days everything's wired, but not always. If I always say, if you can fill it with cash, it's been used, a freezer, a trunk, a bathtub. But in most cases, it could range anywhere from, corruption, like you're thinking about an actual bribe, all the way to sometimes we call the grayer area of ethics scandals, which to me, there's a real difference between the actual impropriety that occurs with bribes and the appearance, which is really typically governed by our ethics rules. So, and then everything in between.
Yeah. All right. So maybe could you give us like a little bit of an overview of sort of the legal structures that we have in the U.S. federal government to try to, maybe we should start with prevention and then turn to enforcement. But what are sort of the preventive measures within the government currently that are in place to try to prevent this type of corruption from occurring?
So the way that the United States approaches the prevention, the detection, and the mitigation of corruption, and let me just be clear, I'm not saying how does it avoid corruption or how does it eliminate corruption, because it's impossible to eliminate corruption. No society, no organization is immune from corrupting forces. But the best that a country can do is try to prevent it from happening in the first place, detect it and then mitigate it. So the way that the United States approaches this is through a set of kind of overlapping tools. And again, in this instance, if we want to focus exclusively on kind of corruption involving government officials, it's a set of different tools. So first and foremost, and I think this is a key to a lot of what the U.S. government does, is transparency. So that can be in the way that we publish our laws and rules and expectations. That can be the way that we share information publicly when there's investigations. That's there's lots of public announcements about things. There's access to how the government spends its money. There's access to information about excluded companies. So a lot of this information is made public. Now, we're not a perfect country, but transparency is key.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that. So what is it in the transparency regime that would allow an interested member of the public, for example, to know whether or not a government official had somehow improperly abused their position? In other words, what would we be looking for in what is publicly available if we were trying to spot instances of corruption?
Some of it is just in disclosures. So, there are some financial disclosure expectations of officials, depending, how public they are, how much has to be disclosed is related to the type of position that they hold within the government. So some of that could happen. Sometimes it's through old-fashioned digging by investigative reporters or civil society organizations to get access to information. Sometimes it's through the reports of other tools, whether it's investigations by Congress, and we can get into that in a little bit, but Congress or IGs or other things like that expose problems within a particular government program or particular contract award or particular some sort of government use of power that expose these issues where clearly there's some connection to the government official. And then, of course, good old-fashioned whistleblowers. So there's a variety of ways that these things can come to light, but they're overlapping. You need all of them.
Yeah, and you mentioned in their Inspector General's offices, what role do they play from an anti-corruption perspective?
Sure. So I would categorize that under the broader umbrella of what I refer to as oversight. So when we're talking about oversight, there's a variety of different players in this area, and that can be agency inspectors general, which play an absolute critical role as the agency watchdogs, rooting out fraud, waste, and abuse and potential corruption. It can be the Government Accountability Office, GAO, an arm of Congress, actually, that does its own audits and investigations of government spending and programs. It brings things to light. It can be the role of Congress itself. The legislative branch plays a role in providing oversight. How rigorous that oversight is often depends on who's in control of which, who's in control of the executive branch and the legislative branch and vice versa. But all three play an incredibly important role in looking into things. They receive complaints and tips themselves, but also some of them are self-initiated investigations and wonderfully make these investigations public and their audits public. So you can see this information, oversight.gov, or you can get GAO's audits on their own website. And of course, we know when Congress has investigations, many times a lot of those things are made public as well.
Yeah, so there is a lot of publicly available information, and with the wonders of the internet, a lot of that information is now fairly broadly available as well. I will say, though, even as an attorney who sort of works in an area of law that is sort of tangentially connected to all of this, it can still be quite challenging to kind of like work your way through those materials. It's not as simple as just going to like one place and typing in a simple search and being like, oh, okay, now I figured it out, right? I mean, these materials are spread out in a lot of different places. You have to know how to find them. You have to know how to search them. Sometimes the government databases are not the most robust in terms of their search capabilities. So, I guess I would say, like, what from your perspective, like, how good is our transparency mechanisms, and like, what are the ways that we could actually improve that, so that so that all of that information which is out there actually could become accessible and understandable to more people?
So we are transparent, and comparatively to other countries, we're actually quite transparent, not in everything, but in a good amount of what we do. However, one of the things that you pointed out was, oh my goodness, the government websites that house a lot of this information are clunky, are not user-friendly, are difficult to navigate. The worst of which is FAPIS. For those of you that are interested, I don't know if you've been on it yourself,
what
but
is that?
FAPIIS, that's the acronym FAPIS, where it's supposed to house information about government contractors that have, entered into settlements or might be under administrative agreements, and other types of, I would call it a government contractor misconduct database, if you will. That'd be the best way to describe it. It is one of the worst websites I've ever seen. And there's not been a program that I haven't screamed about FAPIS and how poor it is. So they're often poorly run. And often that information is through disparate sites. Now, I know there's been a move to consolidate some of these things to make it better and easier. But government tech is far behind, and it's not perfect. Ask anybody that's ever submitted a FOIA request. It's not a perfect system, but it's certainly fairly good, and comparatively to the rest of the world, it's quite good. But it's not without its, warts.
Yeah, I think there's some room there for some enterprising, tech savvy person to somehow consolidate a lot of that information and put it all in one place and make it available to the public. There may not be a lot of money in that, but it would be a good public service that maybe somebody can do down the road. Okay, so there are these various oversight functions in the government. There are also some very specific rules and regulations that various government agencies can enforce. So maybe tell us a little bit about that, maybe starting with the government contracting area and the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. What is it in those regulations that is sort of directed most specifically at corruption issues?
The way I would describe it is that, I always have a slide when I first do my first class at the start of the semester, and I kind of show the various tools that we have to combat corruption, and it involves transparency and oversight. It involves things like bid protests, which help keep officials in check to make sure they're following the law. It includes things like corporate compliance, things we're not really focused on so much today. But two of the biggies are the laws and enforcement. And I'm often asked by developing countries when I do a lot of work helping to train and provide guidance to foreign countries or developing countries that are trying to improve their anti-corruption laws and programs. They'll ask what's more important, and I'll say both, because you can have the best laws in the world, but if you don't enforce them, then you've got impunity, and that's awful. By the same token, if the laws are ineffective, they're not going to get at the type of conduct or misconduct, if you will, that you need them to. So there are a variety of laws. So I would break them into three categories. You mentioned the FAR-based laws, which we'll talk about, ethics laws, and then criminal statutes. From the FAR perspective, oh my goodness, there are a multitude of compliance requirements for anybody that seeks to do business or does business with the government. But the ones really getting at corruption, it gets back to what's your definition of corruption. So it has blanket prohibitions on, bribery, gratuities, and how that can taint the process. It's not worded in the same way as the criminal statutes, but it really gets to the impact if a contract is tainted. There's things that deal with conflicts of interest, things that deal with collusive behavior, whether it's bid rigging or price fixing, something like that. There's provisions that deal with procurement integrity, making sure people aren't leaking sensitive or confidential information. It has things that deal with, post-employment restrictions. So that's Procurement Integrity Act. It has corporate compliance and ethics requirements. Just a whole host of things, among many, many, many others that it expects contractors to do.
there's a sense in which the federal government is just a business entity, right? It goes out in the market and it buys stuff that it just needs to operate, right? It's just buying supplies, products, services, just like any other large business entity would. And certainly in the business world, there is, a lot of stuff that goes on in the business world that nobody would ever think of as corruption. People think of it as networking or I don't know, what are the other words people use to describe it? It just sort of, you send the nice holiday basket to the clients that are good and send you work. You take people out to lunch. You invite them, on little trips or whatever the things are that people in the business world do to kind of maintain and grow that network of connections that will feed their business. And we don't think of it in the private sector as anything particularly unusual or wrongful, at least normally. That's just sort of considered the normal, business activity. And yet when the government kind of enters into that space, and we call it procurement, right? A lot of that kind of stuff starts to at least have that little bit of a whiff of corruption. So like, how do we draw those lines, and how do government officials have to act differently in the marketplace than say just a private buyer?
Sure. So it's why so many commercial entities that wind up doing government contracts get into trouble, because the kind of hospitality that they're used to providing, although I even think that some companies have gotten better at regulating that in recent years, but even the basic things like a lunch or a basket of chocolates around, Christmas, something like that, will be problematic. And that's where kind of the government ethics rules come into play, where we're not really dealing necessarily with criminality, where it kind of crosses the line into what we would typically think of as bribes or even, criminal gratuities. But really, common business courtesies that you would see. But because of the fact that we're using taxpayer dollars, there's a significantly greater number of restrictions. And again, the point is the fact that it's taxpayer dollars, the fact that the officials are holding positions of trust, and we want to be sure that they're making decisions that are in the best interest of the government, in the best interest of its constituents, and not necessarily in their own best interest. Like, it's not who takes them out to the fanciest lunches, it's because they actually have the best product and are providing the best value to the government. So that's where a lot of this comes from. It is, yes, let's be clear, it is the government operating with its business hat, but it's a business in which one of the parties is a superpower. And so there are unique components to it. They get special things. They can just terminate a contract for convenience. There's a lot of different rules that apply in the government contract world that wouldn't necessarily apply in the commercial world. But because of the fact that the government is a steward of taxpayer dollars and providing for its citizens, you've got to have these extra checks in place.
And how much of that is driven by, I know like in the ethics world, right, we talk about improprieties, but then we talk about the appearance of improprieties, right? Part of the problem of corruption at the government level has to just do with, yes, you want the government spending taxpayer dollars efficiently, but I think part of it also perhaps goes to just the very legitimacy of the government, and so and just sort of protecting the government from criticism by its own citizens, right? And so, how much of these rules that are built into the FAR, for example, are really directed more at appearance versus reality?
Well, if we're talking about ethics rules, we're going to be going out. So, some of it is built into the FAR, some of it is reiterated, but really we're going into other federal regulations, and that's generally applicable across the government to federal employees. So, except the president and vice president, which we can talk about. But mostly these federal ethics rules that we're dealing with, they apply across the board because the concern is the actual appearance, as you said, of impropriety and not actual impropriety, because you want people to have faith in their government that they're using the resources for a good purpose. And I'll give you an example. If you think about some countries that have, endemic corruption issues, many of them, some of their citizens can't even get access to basic, services. Maybe they have to pay a bribe to get seen at a hospital, or pay a bribe in order to, go get their electricity turned on, whatever it is. I don't want to say it's a way of life, because it's not. Nobody wants to wake up every morning and pay a bribe, but there's impunity in those countries, and it's very common. I think a lot of what the expectation is that across the board, when you're dealing with government officials, whether they're in the role of a government procurement, or they're in a role of simply, they're an enforcement attorney or whatever their job is, that they're doing it with the government interest in mind, and that's in the best interest of the government. And I agree with you. You're right. There is a legitimacy component, because when people view their own governments as corrupt, it creates instability. It's part of the reason that the United States spends so much money and effort and time working with developing countries to try to reduce corruption in these countries, because instability leads to much bigger problems and national security problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're sort of lucky in the sense that we live in a country where we have a lot of anti-corruption rules that are generally enforced. But even then, when there are these moments of like publicly exposed corruption, and we'll talk about some of them in a little bit, maybe, they are very kind of like shaking. I think we'll talk a little bit about Fat Leonard, I think, coming up. But that was one I remember when I first read about that, I was just sort of stunned by it. And in countries where that is pervasive, I think sometimes corruption can lead to the overthrow of governments, the fall of governments. Citizens will become angry enough that they will kind of break outside of the normal rule of law and take things into their own hands. And I think that's really why, at root, at some level, almost more important than just the taxpayer dollar side of this.
Well, that's Afghanistan. That's what you're describing. Corruption that leads to people, I don't want to say taking the law into their own hands, but going much further than that. There's a great book by the author Sarah Chayes, Thieves of State, that talks about the role of corruption in undermining the stability of Afghanistan and kind of creating the terrorism issue. And so that's why currently the Biden administration has identified corruption as a national security priority. I think in December, we're going to get a report back from many of the different agencies talking about the roles that they can play in addressing corruption because of its impact on security.
And I think we should spend a little time talking about some of that stuff, but maybe we should just kind of close the circle and finish kind of letting you describe a little bit about U.S. law. And I think you were getting to sort of maybe briefly describing what the key anti-corruption laws were and how they're enforced.
Sure. So when you're dealing with what we typically call like corruption, and in this instance, we're really kind of talking about bribery-like behavior. We have a multitude of tools at the government's disposal to go after this type of conduct. I will make one quick plug that we have a really powerful tool that goes after the bribery of foreign government officials under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is very robustly enforced and has played a huge role in kind of overhauling the government's approach to how companies deal with like internal compliance programs. But let's take a look back in the United States. If we're talking about corruption in the United States, the centerpiece of our domestic bribery statutes is 18 USC 201. And that is really your classic bribery statute. It actually covers two crimes, bribery and gratuities. But bribery is what we think of when we think of like the words quid pro quo, which have become more famous in recent years. But really, there is an offer or a promise or the actual payment of a bribe in exchange for an official act. And that's going to be your bribery violation, which can be somewhat difficult to prove. The second illegal activity, the gratuities, which is really when something's given, a thing of value is given, for because of an official act. You might be thinking to yourself, what's the difference between those two? In practice, sometimes people like to say a bribe says please, whereas a gratuity says thank you. Another way I like to explain it to my students is that gratuities, which the penalties are much, much lower, is really just a weak bribery case. So typically you're going to see the gratuities charged when the bribery case isn't that strong. And this deals with federal officials.
And so one of the words you used in describing that law was official acts, right? So I take it that when government officials are actually prosecuted under this law, one of the big questions is always, did the thing they got, the money or the, gift or whatever it was, did it actually have the necessary connection to something quote unquote official? Is that right?
Sure. So taking away from 18 USC 201, there are a host of other statutes that can get after similar behavior. And I want to explain why, because to get to the official act story, I want to tell you anything ranging from the statute that goes after honest services fraud, the Hobbs Act. There are other fraud related statutes that have the word fraud in them, but that deal with kind of similar conduct. But in this instance, the word official action, really, or not the word, but the words, official action really get at this exercise of government of power. And this was right on display in a recent Supreme Court case involving the former governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell. And so that case was a fascinating case where the former governor basically was accused of accepting bribes, and it was a variety of different things. It was, shopping trips for his wife, paying for part of his daughter's wedding, no interest loans. There's a great picture that they used at the trial where he's in like the fancy sports car sporting the Rolex. That was the gift. It's always a Rolex. I always say that's the bribery gift of choice, but Rolex hasn't taken me up on the offer to use that as their no advertising campaign. So a ton of different things of value, which is the term of art we use in these cases. In that one. And it was given to him by this guy who had a nutritional supplement made out of tobacco, which should be the first light bulb going off in your head that this didn't sound quite above board. And what he effectively did is give these gifts, and in return, he was hoping to get Virginia, some studies from the universities in Virginia to help effectively eventually get approval for this product. And in exchange for what he did, they promoted the product at the governor's mansion, and McDonnell set up some meetings. And, he was convicted at trial, and then it went up to the Fourth Circuit, and it was affirmed. And then it went up to the Supreme Court, and they threw it out. And the reason they said, and then I believe Justice Roberts said that he used the words tawdry tale. This is it was not pretty. Nobody looked good in this prosecution. But he basically said that setting up meetings is and hosting an event at the governor's mansion is not a quote unquote official act or official action within the meaning of the statute. And this one we were dealing with the honest services fraud statute.
Where does that sort of leave us under that statute now? Because it seems in reading that opinion, which I did in getting ready to talk to you today, that it sort of creates this giant loophole through which any clever bribe-taking government official could drive their brand new Mercedes. Maybe that's overstating it, but the things that are described in the Supreme Court's opinion that the governor did, while they might not have been formal government action in the sense of signing the order or, giving out the license, it does seem clear that he was using his position as the governor. He was using his government position to benefit this company. And he was able to, or maybe he didn't, maybe this didn't actually happen, but he was certainly able to use his position as the governor to cause perhaps other people to engage in what we might think of as official acts, right? And so how hard has that Supreme Court decision made it now for prosecutors to actually crack down on this kind of activity?
So I think it's created two problems. The first is this kind of, you talk about this loophole that's been created where it feels like, the quote, we're just concerned now at the quid part. We're not concerned anymore with the quid part. We're just concerned with the quo part. Sorry, I said that wrong. We're just concerned with the quo part, the official action, not the front end. So it's created this where people could effectively start paying for access, which we know access is everything. So if I, start writing checks or pay bribes or, provide a car, whatever you wanted, or a Rolex, if you will, to a government official, just to get some meetings set up, and that's all they do, just to get me in the room, that might not be an official action under this decision. And so you could have people basically charging for setting up meetings. And so it's created this really odd situation where a lot of us find this incredibly troubling. And you have to look at this. And I will say, as far as the prosecution standpoint, yes, of course, it's definitely made it more difficult. I will say I've listened to and talked to government prosecutors and people in the FBI who have said really what it just means is you've got to collect more evidence about the official action part of it when you're trying to make your case. But I think the bigger problem, and it's a much larger problem, stems from the fact that this is one of a series of cases by the Supreme Court, or in the Supreme Court, involving corruption, where the Supreme Court has reined in the ability of prosecutors to bring these cases. It started with Sun Diamond. It moved to the Skilling case that's coming out of Enron. And then we have the McDonnell case, where basically in all these cases, they had different facts and they involved different aspects of corruption prosecutions. But in each one of them, there was this reining in of prosecutorial discretion, reining in of the definitional aspects of these various statutes that were used or at issue in these cases. And because there's been this kind of string of cases, I think there is genuine concern, and at least I'm concerned too, that anytime the government brings a case going forward, that unless it's an absolute slam dunk and it's just overwhelming evidence, and even those cases that are close, they're going to be shy away from the cases that could be corrupt, but might put them in jeopardy of losing even more of the prosecutorial discretion if it were to go up to SCOTUS.
Yeah, and there is an aspect to the corruption that kind of goes beyond the quo and the quid pro quo. I mean, I can imagine a hypothetical. Let's say I'm the governor of a state and I want to pad my own pocket. And I affirmatively go to you as a business person and I say, hey, I will set up meetings with you, with anybody in the government you need to meet with in order to promote your business, but you have to buy me a Rolex first. Okay. And then let's say you do that and you buy me the Rolex and I never set up a single meeting for you. In other words, you get no benefit from having bribed me, but I have benefited from the bribe. Is that a violation of federal law? And which law is that a violation of?
Well, I mean, it depends on so you wouldn't be using 18 USC 201 because that's for federal employees only, but it could be something like honest services fraud. It could be Hobbs Act, depending on all the various facts. I'm going to say it depends, right? That's the typical law student answer. But yeah, I mean, in those types of instances, the violation occurs traditionally when the secret deal is struck. It's the violation of making that deal. I mean, in many of these criminal statutes, it regulates not just the giving of something, but it's the offer or the promise. And so you could, even if a bribe is not successful, this violation occurs when that kind of secret, illegal, or illicit deal is struck. And so I think that you could certainly set that up. And in fact, that happens. I mean, not as regularly in the United States, but in other countries. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems that many companies have internationally, is that they try to do business in a country and there are many, many officials standing there with their hands out. And whereas the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act goes after the company for paying the bribe, it can't touch the foreign officials. So unlike the FCPA in the United States, at least, many of these statutes go after both sides of the equation. Not all of them, though.
So let's talk for a moment about one of the really most fascinating corruption scandals that I think has hit the U.S. government in recent years. which is generally referred to as the Fat Leonard Scandal. The guy they refer to as Fat Leonard was Leonard Glenn Francis, who owned a company called Glenn Defense Marine Asia. And I take it that this company was based in various ports in Asia, and that he offered services to the U.S. Navy in terms of taking care of their ships or doing certain things for those ships when they were in parked basically in various Asian ports. And it came to light at some point that he had been giving various types of favors, shall we say, to various high-ranking officers in the U.S. Navy in exchange for steering their ships to ports where he could service them, for giving him contracts, and I think it's even been alleged for sharing information with him about the movement of U.S. Navy ships that was supposed to be sort of secret information for sort of obvious reasons. You don't necessarily want your enemies knowing exactly where you're going to put your Navy ships as they're moving around the oceans. And there was a huge number of Navy officials that were implicated in this. I think many of them have had various types of legal proceedings brought against them, some of them criminal, some of them were court-martialed. I think it's still ongoing, maybe. The investigation's not even over. And the thing about this that I think is really, really significant, I mean, it's just a great story and a tawdry story, and it's got all kinds of crazy details in it. But what's really shocking to me, and I think what this story really tells us is, two things. One, my understanding is that it went on for quite a number of years before it became public and before anybody was stopped. And that had something to do with the fact that although there were people within the government who sort of were very suspicious of what was going on, some of the very officials that were charged with overseeing these contracts and supposedly trying to root out the corruption were themselves part of the corruption. So that's a sort of a big problem. But also I think there's a sense in which this is almost the last place you would expect to see this kind of scandal. I mean, we think of military officers as being, people that we've really, that the country has put a lot of trust in, that they're highly trained. I assume that in their military training, they get lots of training on ethics and doing the right thing and being honorable and all of those traits. And yet here is this huge scandal smack dab right in the middle of really high-ranking officers within the U.S. Navy. So I'll just kind of ask you, what is your take on the Fat Leonard scandal, and what do you think the public should take away from it?
Jokingly, I always say if your business partner or an individual confronts you with an opportunity and they have a nickname, to run screaming, because truly some of the biggest scandals, and I could go through a list of like 10 of them, they all have involved like people with nicknames.
Right. So we just need to pass a new provision in the FAR. Thou shalt not contract with anybody with a nickname. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Problem solved.
No, but I will say, and I think, I'm not going to lie, I think it's the size, the scope, the salacious facts, because as you mentioned, when we talk about things of value, which is the term of art we typically use in corruption cases, it can range anything from money to hospitality to meals to, in this particular case, prostitutes. And so I think it's the salacious nature of it. I think it's how many people were implicated. I think the nickname plays a big role in it. I mean, what nickname has, not since Darlene Druyan had the Dragon Lady nickname, have we had this good of a nickname in a scandal within government contracting. So I think it's how big it was. I think it's the fact that it was so expansive and so, I mean, he had moles planted within the government, the amount of access that he had, the amount of money involved, the amount of fraud that was occurring, the number of high-ranking officials implicated, the fact that, as you said, it involved somebody who's designed to root out fraud, waste, and abuse and corruption was implicated in this as well. And a lot of people, I think, in the articles that I've read, chalk it up to his personality, that he was just incredibly persuasive and charismatic. Interestingly, there's a new podcast, not to compete with this phenomenal podcast, but there's actually a Fat Leonard where he's being interviewed and speaking directly, and he's apparently very mad. So I've heard it's excellent. Everybody knows has to listen to it. I have not had a chance to get to it, but I've heard it's great. So you could probably hear from, the horse's mouth, but it was massive. And when massive scandals break, it really grabs everyone's attention.
Yeah, no. And I read in one place that, somebody was sort of offering the opinion that the scandal is becoming a huge problem for the Navy because so many of the high-ranking Navy officers have been implicated in this, that there may actually be sort of like an officer shortage for a time being in the Navy.
I didn't know that.
because so many, admirals, really high-ranking people have basically been shut down because of this scandal. But again, to me, it's just sort of like, okay, well, if it can happen there,
yeah,
it can kind of happen anywhere. And again, like it was happening for many, many years before it ever became public. So I guess to anybody who would say, well, the U.S. government is not a particularly corrupt government, I guess I would say, yeah. How do you know that? It's tricky. And I think I had asked you this question a little bit offline before we did the interview, but I'll ask you again now, which is sort of like how are we supposed to judge sort of how corrupt a government is, or how pervasive corruption is within a government, or even within a particular agency of a government? Is there any way for us to know that based on statistics or anecdotal or any other measure? How do we know whether we're doing a good job or not at policing this kind of conduct?
So just like when you asked me kind of for definitionally what is corruption, and there's no one perfect definition, there's no one perfect way to necessarily measure corruption. And a few organizations have tried. The most famous of it is Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, which they release every year. I'm not a huge fan of the CPI, not because I think that it's like so far off base, but I don't love the ranking system. And the reason I don't is because I think it certainly highlights areas where there's just huge corruption problems where companies typically will not want to do business, or for purposes of identifying, countries where it'd be difficult to get anything done because of corruption. So I appreciate that, and on a generally, when you kind of look at it, the countries typically fall where you would expect. And again, it's based on perceptions. It's not based on some sort of like independent, it's perceived corruption. The concern I have with it is that I think it gives the companies what you would call like the clean end of the scale a pass, that if they're at the top of the corruption perception index, then maybe it seems like they have no corruption issues. And there's an anecdote that has traveled among, all of us that do this for a living, where a very, very high-ranking country, I think Scandinavian country, had a corruption scandal, but swept it under the rug because they didn't want it to impact their ranking on the Corruption Perception Index. So I think it can, really incentivize that type of conduct. And I think there's a lot of mushiness in between what each number means in your exact ranking, and sliding and moving up or moving down. I think there are other organizations that do it. Trace is another one that has like a bribery matrix. And I think it's helpful for due diligence perspectives of knowing whether entering a jurisdiction is a high risk jurisdiction or a lower risk jurisdiction. But I think it's mostly that. I don't put too much weight into, if you're 27 this year and now you're 28, does that really mean something? There used to be some organizations that looked at a variety of factors and doing an analysis. And in fact, there are organizations even now that will look at things like what do their ethics laws say? And, they look at the rule of law, and they look at, the quality of their laws, their enforcement record, things that we look at, transparency, a variety of factors to try to give you a better picture of what you're dealing with in the country. And I think those tend to work a little bit. Coalition for Integrity is a good one. They do what's called the Swamp Index, and that's how they've ranked the states. and corruption issues at the state level. And I like those a little bit better, that I can pull up a chart and kind of say like, oh, they don't have like an independent ethics commission, or they don't, regulate this. I think that's a little bit more helpful than just saying like, I'm number 15 on the, index.
Yeah. So the index that transparency.org puts out, I take it, is sort of based on surveys of business people who are doing business in the countries. Is that right?
Yeah. It's perceived corruption.
Yeah. And I mean, it is interesting. The United States, if you ask most people in this country, where do you think we ranked? I bet you they would say higher than 25. And we're currently ranked 25 on that index. So there's 24 countries, at least 24 countries ahead of us. But that is different than actually looking at specific metrics, like, well, what are the laws in that country, and so forth. But I take it that there's no actual like statistics. There's nothing you could point to say, oh, this percentage of government officials take bribes in this country versus this other country. There's nothing like that. I mean, I don't know how you would even compile statistics like that. That would be very tricky, because you would have to get people to admit that they were taking bribes. But
there's enforcement indexes. Like Trace does an enforcement report where they look to actual prosecutions, and so that actually gives you an impression of that. But I mean, think about how, there's some enforcement, but how much corruption is going unpunished.
Right. And it kind of goes to the point I think you made earlier, that there's a difference between having a good law and then actually enforcing that law as well, right?
Yep.
I mean, you could have all of the legal structures in place, but then you also have to have a well-funded, independent prosecutor. You have to have an adequately funded, independent judiciary that'll apply the law correctly. All of those types of structures that for the most part we have in this country, but hard to judge country to country, I suppose.
That's true.
So let's talk about a couple of things that have been in the news lately that I sort of previewed at the top of the show, that I think kind of exist in this gray area where some people might see them as corruption, others might not. And just as somebody who studies this area and thinks about it very deeply, I just kind of wonder how you think about it. And to prove that we are a completely bipartisan show, I'll give you one example from the Republican side and one example from the Democratic side. So on the Republican side, we had the situation during the Trump administration where Trump claimed to have given up control of his companies, but in fact still owned the companies, right? And one of those companies owned a very large hotel here in the District of Columbia, not, I think, just a couple of blocks away from the White House, the Trump International Hotel in the old post office building. It's a beautiful building in downtown DC. I guess it was actually a post office at one time. And somehow, before he became president, Donald Trump, through one of his companies, managed to get a long-term lease for that building and turned it into sort of a high-end hotel. And then while he was president, it was, I think, sort of common knowledge, not even really a secret, that lots of various organizations and foreign countries and so forth, when they wanted to do something in the District of Columbia, their first choice would be to do it at that hotel. And the concern was that this was a sort of a backdoor way of signaling to the President of the United States that they were supporting his business by throwing a big event or renting a bunch of rooms at the hotel, and that this was sort of an indirect way to exert some influence or garner some favor with the president. So putting on your anti-corruption, ethics, professorial hat, how do you sort of think about that situation?
It was a disaster. To me, it was the original sin, right? Maintaining his business interests directly led to some of the most troubling, and none of it was necessarily I don't want to even get down the road of like emoluments, but none of it was necessarily a violation of certain ethics laws, because the president and the vice president are exempt from a lot of the ethics restrictions. But it was this just kind of display of clear attempts by lobbyists and foreign officials and anyone that sought to get anything from the administration, putting money in the pockets of Trump and his family through the hotel. And, most administrations take great pains to try to separate the presidency from certain business interests because there's a true concern over appearance issues and worries about people assuming that the president is taking actions because of profit versus the best interests of the government and its citizens. But there was no care about this. The Trump administration truly, to me, had one of the most egregious and infuriating approaches to ethics that I think we've ever seen in the United States. And whether it was this component to it, whether it was the many conflicts that his children who did work in government, this is Ivanka and Jared, whether it was the routine violations of the Hatch Act, which were just in a report released by the Office of Special Counsel, outlined in great detail the many violations of the Hatch Act. There was just this lack of concern and frankly, just flagrant violation routinely of ethics violations within the administration. And again, to me, the biggest one was retaining the business interests, but also, I get asked a lot that, one of the other ones that to me was trying to use your hotel for major international conferences, trying to make that the location. I could go through the laundry list of the types of things. But on some level, it almost did the United States a favor because we, for a long time, and we meaning me, would routinely stand up in many of my capacity building efforts in front of developing countries and talk about the strength of our excellent federal ethics regime and how we had this wonderful multitude of laws that are designed to prevent even appearance issues. And the Trump administration just blew that wide open and said, no, these aren't the strength of laws. This is the strength of norms. And for all these years leading up to the Trump administration, we've been abiding by norms and expectations, particularly when it comes to the president and vice president. And when you have somebody in that role that doesn't care about the norms, it basically took ethics and flushed it down the toilet. So it basically exposed a lot of weaknesses that we as a government need to fix.
That's interesting. What do you think just focusing on the hotel issue for example, what changes would you make in the laws that would ameliorate the risk of something like that happening again?
First, I think that he shouldn't have been able to retain his lease with GSA at any point. There were actually, I have colleagues that have written on it on the reasons why that shouldn't have been the case. Putting that aside and maintaining his general business interests, there's a reason why that past presidents have segregated themselves from their business interests. And I think that needs to be a piece of it. I think finding a way, and I realize that there's separation of powers issues associated with this, but finding a way to create some sort of ethical construct around the president so that this couldn't happen again, I think would be a piece of it. Another big piece of it, so we're talking about the hotel. So a lot of it is just the necessity of segregating you from business interests and then potentially strengthening the application of ethics laws. But another piece of it that it blew right open was the enforcement mechanism associated with these ethics violations. The Office of Government Ethics does not have enforcement capabilities. In many instances, particularly, for example, the Hatch Act, the ability to enforce this statute or the ability to take action against government officials that violated the Hatch Act resided with the president himself. So when you're dealing with White House officials that violated the law or certain senior level officials within agencies, it depended on Trump himself saying this is not acceptable. And when you have a president who says, I don't care about the Hatch Act, well, then that's the tone at the top that nobody cares about the Hatch Act, and it lets a really important law go unenforced. So I think part of it is strengthening the rules. Part of it is changing the enforcement mechanisms that are in play. And part of it is really taking pains to try to shore up what I call some of the loopholes that I think were grossly exploited.
Yeah, and I think it also reveals the fact that although we sort of have this rhetoric in our country about nobody's above the law and the president isn't above the law, in some sense, the president will always be above the law because the law is only as good as the enforcement mechanisms behind it. And when the person at the top doesn't want to enforce those laws, it creates a problem, right? So let me ask you about another sort of corruption-based issue, this one relating to the Biden presidency, and this has been in the news lately. It's something that's going on right now. So Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, apparently is a sort of an amateur artist. And after Joseph Biden was elected president, Hunter Biden's stock in the art world apparently went way up, and he currently has an exhibit at a very high-end gallery up in New York City where his paintings apparently are selling for a lot of money. And at least in the Republican media, this is being portrayed as an instance of corruption. The New York Post, which is sort of a Republican-leaning newspaper up in New York, ran the headline recently. It says, Vincent Van Gogh, Hunter Biden's corrupt art show opens in New York City. So that's how it's being perceived by some people. So how do you see that issue? And is it just the same as the Trump hotel, or is it something different?
It's definitely not the same as the Trump hotel, which I would put on, like, if the Hunter Biden scandal is a 5 or a 3, the Trump hotel is a 10. But it's still problematic. And here's why. Let me just say this, from the fact that he's an adult child, you've got to be sympathetic to the fact that an adult child of a president should ideally be able to, earn their own living and have their own profession. So that has to be said at the outset, that if he wants to be an artist, I have no problem with Hunter Biden being an artist. The concern here is the same concern we had in the last administration, is that there's a fear that people may be using this profession as a means to gain influence within the Biden administration. So there's a few factors that make me think that this is problematic. One is the fact that he's an inexperienced artist, and the amount that the art is going for suggests not that suddenly a gallery owner's discovered this brilliant new artist, and I'm not an art person, so I can't tell you about the quality of the work, but is capitalizing on the Biden name. But let's be clear, this would not be the first time someone's capitalized off the name of their, presidential parent. The second piece of it is that they're shrouding this in secrecy. They could have been incredibly transparent and just released the name of the buyers, made this information available to the public so that watchdogs, civil society, media could keep track of who's buying the paintings to make sure they're not trying to, seek some sort of favor with the Biden administration. They didn't do that. They decided to basically shut it down so that allegedly all the prospective buyers will be vetted by this gallery owner, and no one will know the owners, not even Hunter Biden, or the purchasers of the paintings, not even Hunter Biden. So that's the way they're trying to get around the ethics issue, saying not even a Hunter will know, so there's no way this could influence the Biden administration. The problem is you're outsourcing basically an ethics function to a gallery owner. And there's no way to enforce this. There's no way to know if people are following through on it. There's no prohibition on the buyer actually contacting Hunter. So it's fake. They're saying that this is a mechanism to help with ethics, and it's not. Now, Hunter Biden's not a government employee, so he's not covered by ethics. And we've already talked about the fact that the president's not covered by these ethics rules. So we're not dealing with an actual legal violation here, unlike when we were talking about in the Trump administration, where you actually had some violations of the law. Here we're dealing with stuff where there's no violation, but there's an appearance issue. And the Biden administration came into the presidency saying, like, we are going to be the most transparent, the most ethical administration ever, trying to kind of get rid of the tarnish of the prior administration. Yet here we have this issue. And in my opinion, the better way to proceed would have been to be far more transparent about this, or in the alternative, just hold off on selling the paintings until his father left the presidency. I mean, to me, those were the more viable ethical options, and they chose an option I don't think particularly works and has opened them up to rightful criticism. Yeah. I think that the problem in all of this is that we started to see, just like many other aspects of our life, the politicization of the issue of corruption. And it is truly exemplified by Trump in the Trump children, the Trump himself on one hand, and Hunter Biden in the other hand. It used to be, when I would teach my class 10 years ago, that everyone kind of agreed what was corrupt. Like, this seemed like this was unethical or corrupt, and everyone kind of had one definition and could point to something and say, yeah, I agree, that's corrupt. ever since Trump took office, I've started to see really what people think is corrupt depends on who's committing it. If it's your team, then it's not corrupt. If it's the other team, it is corrupt. And that's to me the most concerning, which is that if you think that what Hunter Biden is doing is problematic, then you should have been concerned with what, Don Jr. and Eric Trump were doing. And if you think what Trump's children were doing was problematic, then you should be concerned with what Hunter Biden is doing. So, at the end of the day, the rules are the rules, and we have these rules for a reason, and people act ethically, or we expect officials and their children to act ethically, or we hope they'll act ethically. And across the board, we should have the same expectations regardless of which party it belongs to.
Right. No, I mean, it's a sort of a dangerous symptom of kind of a breakdown in norms. I think something that you had said earlier. There's a difference between the rules and the norms, and this sort of willingness to accept corruption on your own team, but see it everywhere on the other team, seems to be a norm problem that cuts across a lot of different issues in our politics right now, I'm sure. Well, okay, I'll ask you an open-ended question as somebody who really thinks deeply about these issues and studies them. Where are the holes in our current legal system for dealing with corruption, and how would you fix them?
So if I could wave my magic wand today, one is I'd go in and fix some of the corruption statutes. Congress needs to go in and amend them after they've been unduly restricted by the Supreme Court. I think that we really need to go back and reevaluate some of the things that have made it harder for these prosecutions to take place. So I think that's one area. And then the other part is dealing with the ethics issue. So that could be tightening up some of the ethics rules. It could deal with enforcement. There's so many variations on how the ethics rules could be improved. Whistleblower laws could be improved. Protections for federal employees could be improved. I think that the independence of our inspectors general is something that I think we could work on that could help reveal more corruption activities. Transparency could be improved. Certainly we could get some better websites. So there are a lot of areas. I mean, I've just truly touched on just a small portion of them. But we have a lot of work to do. I think as far as if we're looking at countries, I mean, yes, we're ranked 25 out of how many, right? As a general rule, we are a low-ish corruption-oriented country. We don't have some of this systemic impunity that you see in other countries. But I think recent years have demonstrated to us just how weak and how fragile our system is, and how much we've relied on norms, and how much these laws need to be tightened, and how much our approach needs to change. We haven't even touched on dark money and money in politics, which is really beyond my expertise, but is a huge piece of this as well. And all of these work together to really help strengthen our system. And so I really need a very, very large magic wand to accomplish everything that needs to be done.
Well, I'm glad there are folks like you and your colleagues at GW who are thinking about these issues. As I said before, I think they're fundamental, not just to protecting the public fisc and taxpayer dollars, which in and of itself is a worthwhile goal. But I think as we sort of experience maybe a little bit of corruption creep, slowly eroding the rules that govern it, and sort of eroding maybe the norms at the top of the government around ethics and corruption issues, that if we don't nip it in the bud, it can lead to very, very dark places down the road, where citizens really start to lose even more faith in the government and government officials. And when that happens, worst case scenario, it can really lead to sort of lawlessness and just kind of breakdown in government institutions. And hopefully we will not get to that place in our country, that we can sort of turn the tide a little bit back the other way. Well, okay. So thank you very much for that very, very interesting, very, very substantive discussion. It is the tip of the iceberg. And There's a lot more to be learned out there. So I would encourage everybody who's listening to this to become a lawyer and go to GW Law School and learn a lot more about it. But let's end with something a little more personal, as we often do. And we were chatting a little bit offline about your experiences over the last, what are we now, almost
2 years,
20 months since this all started. We're sitting here in November of 2021, about 20 months into the COVID pandemic. And you were telling me that you have 2 small children at home, and that you've been also working at home because of the COVID related lockdowns and so forth, and that this has been a very, very challenging time, as it has been for many people. So, maybe just give us a little sense of what your experience has been during this time, trying to be a dean at a major law school and a parent of 2 small children, and doing it all online from home.
Yeah, I don't differ from too many parents, working parents, that have been juggling all of it during this pandemic. It has truly been such an incredibly challenging time with the pandemic. And I joke all the time that I feel like you're constantly in this kind of mode because of all the stress associated with it. But I will say it has improved. So our university has reopened, and I just happen to be working from home today. And it was really nice to get into a chair with back support, because for all the lockdown, and then of course as our university was shut down last year, I was teaching large classes of students from a bed, because as many parents can understand, the place that you have to go to in the house is the quiet spot. I am more fortunate than others. I've heard of people like working out of closets, but I had to stay out of the way of my children, and I had to teach from a bed. So I had to try to make it look like it wasn't a bed. And so I'd have it against a blank wall. I looked like I was in prison. And I often had to apologize for loud noises from children, which I'd always say is my children just expressing enthusiasm for the material. But fortunately, they are back in school now, and on their way to being vaccinated. So I think that's a good sign. And being back has been great. It's been great to be able to see students. It's not a new normal, it's a weird normal. So I wouldn't even call it normal, it's just weird. But it's been good to see people again. And I'm very anxiously looking forward to the time when I can take my children to a movie theater. I can show them the first skyscraper. And I can host events in person again. I'm looking forward to just like seeing people, not worried about being in a place, taking off a mask and eating a meal. I don't know if we'll ever get back to. Do you think we'll get back to that again?
I think we will. Yeah, it's slowly happening, and I think enough people are sick of the masks and sick of the lockdowns that, and that, it seems the medical situation is improving, right? We've just heard in the last couple of weeks that there's now these pills that are going to become available that are really going to make it, hopefully, so that COVID is, just another thing that you get, but it doesn't kill you. And I think once most people realize that that's what it is, then people will just go on with life. You can never get the risk down to 0 for anything, and it's certainly not the only thing you can get sick from. But are there like particular moments that you look back on now from the lockdown that you think were like, oh, that really encapsulates what it's like?
I have PTSD from some aspects of it, and I will tell you. The first thing, the most visible sign in our home, so we live in a townhome, the most visible sign in our home of the pandemic was right when everything locked down. I went onto Amazon and had spent an ungodly amount of money on like activities and things to do for my children. So much so that there's a whole section of our living room that is still a pile of Amazon boxes full of what I call panic pandemic purchases, because I just wanted to make sure I had enough things. But I have to say, like, there was that aspect to it, when you have small children that aren't just going to sit and watch Netflix all day. Like I was not, along with many parents, we did not get into bread making or like pick up hobbies. Like you're very much spent every day that you were home trying to figure out what on earth do we do with these tiny humans. And we were fortunate living in Capitol Hill. This was before obviously the issues in January 6th, but we have these big lawns. So we were investing in like so many balls to just like play in the yards and like keep our kids out. We explored different, parks that I think we probably wouldn't have. When you live in Washington, D.C., you spend a lot of time in museums and take advantage of all those indoor activities. So I think that was a lot of fun, but there's now to the point where I can't go to some of those places anymore because it just reminds me of the lockdown. So I'm sorry, some of the parks have been ruined for me forever, but it was definitely a challenging time, but we are stronger for it.
Yeah. Well, up until this moment, I thought that PPP was just the Paycheck Protection Program loans that every small business in the United States got last year. But now I will think of it instead as panic pandemic purchases. That's good.
Thank you, Amazon.
Yeah. We'll coin that as a term. You better trademark it quickly before I put it on a T-shirt or something. Well, just to wrap up, if people want to kind of learn more about your work or reach out to you, what are good ways for people to find you?
Googling me is one. I mean, I'll come up on the GW website, so my contact information is there. Another place where you can kind of learn more about our work and the program is we have a website called Beyond the FAR, FAR, as in the Federal Acquisition Regulations. That has a lot of information about our programs. And so we're frequently advertising programs that deal with corruption related issues, in addition to obviously procurement. So if that interests you, we will do that. One other plug is that I'm a co-chair of the ABA International Anti-Corruption Committee, and we regularly do programs. So if this is an area of interest to you, think about, joining another section so that you can participate in some of our programming there as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for all of the useful learning we got to do today. And it was really a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Garrulous Gavel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can always find us at garrulousgavel.com. If you'd like to send feedback or suggest a guest, please contact us at our email address, garrulousgavel@gmail.com, or on Twitter at garrulousgavel. Our cover art was created by artist and illustrator extraordinaire Joan Tico. Our theme music was written and performed by scientist and saxophonist extraordinaire Robert Tico. And our producer is the inimitable K.O. Myers of Particulate Media. See you next episode.